This is very exciting. Hi, this is Dale Peterson, and welcome to the Unsolicited Response Show. Joining me on this episode is Grant Geyer. He is the Chief Product Officer with Claroty. Welcome to the show, Grant.
Dale, thanks for having me.
I thought this was a good time to bring you on. Obviously, I bring companies on from time to time that are leaders in the space, but this seemed to be an apropos time because of the large raise, the $140 million venture raise, your Series D, I guess it was. So we'll talk a little bit about that, as well as the fact that you've got sort of a new product category that you're introducing here, the Claroty Edge. And I must admit that when I read the press release on Claroty Edge, I even put this out on social. I was like, okay, but what is it? So I did get a demonstration of it earlier in the week, so I have a better idea of what it is now, and I want to talk about that. But maybe a good place to start is, what problem were you trying to solve, or what problem was Claroty trying to solve with this Edge product, Claroty Edge?
Yeah, well, Dale, we'll certainly demystify it during the course of the conversation today. So if you think through the typical customer journey of an asset owner, it usually starts by getting a really robust asset inventory so that they have the data and have an understanding of what they're trying to protect. And then they'll go through the process of understanding vulnerability management, the inherent risk, and work to reduce that inherent risk through patching or compensating controls. However, if you think about the technology approaches that pretty much all of the vendors, or most of the vendors in the OT detection market, have taken, it's done through passive collection, which is really cumbersome in terms of infrastructure, in terms of configuration, potentially disruptive to network operations, and it has a high total cost of ownership. And when you're done with all of that, a lot of what it delivers, a lot of the perceived value is through threat detection. And most organizations aren't really set up in the early days of their OT security program to instrument the OT alerts into their security operations center, even if they have a security operations center. So our provocation was that it's really the wrong technology starting point for many organizations out there. And really one of our goals is to meet customers on their journey and help provide a simple, easy to use, easy to implement solution. And that was kind of the thesis behind Claroty Edge.
It's certainly in line with what I've seen and what I've written about in terms of these product lines when they started, maybe 2017 or so. They were built as detection products, and we saw almost all of the early use of them, of the passive technology and the other technologies, to be for the asset inventory. So I definitely think you're in line there with what we're seeing in the marketplace in terms of people focusing on that first, because quite frankly, it's a much easier lift. Doing detection on an ongoing basis takes a team, a talented team, takes much more resources than it does to create and maintain an asset inventory. Yeah. So that makes sense. But the products do that now. So maybe if you could take 2 to 3 minutes and explain what Claroty Edge is.
Yeah, well, the analogy that we like to use at Claroty is, if you have 1,000 people in a room that you want to find out details from, their name, their home state, any details you want, it's probably quite cumbersome and maybe a little bit daunting to try to yell out to the room to ask everyone for 1,000 responses at once. And so the analogy that we think about is, rather than get 1,000 responses at once, can we break up the 1,000 people into 100 groups of 10 and nominate one person in each group to gather information about the 10 people around them and then consolidate that information? And that's in essence what we're trying to do with Claroty Edge. We're leveraging Windows systems that are in the OT environments already, HMIs, engineering workstations, DCSs, in which we put a standalone executable, so no registry changes, no services running. It can either run at a time, it can either be run manually through a UI or through a command line interface. And when it runs, it really does 3 things. First is it gathers the information from the host it's operating on. IP address, MAC address, subnets that it's connected to, any networks that are adjacent to it, is the first thing. And also, if knowing it's a Windows device, all of the installed programs and patches that are applied on the system. The second thing it does is that it looks to see what is around. Sorry. The second thing it does is it looks to gather other OT artifacts from that system. So knowing that it might be an engineering workstation, it might have project files on the system, or a DCS might have project files. And so it'll gather those project files and collect them for the purposes of dissection. The third thing it does is then goes through a process of discovery. And the process of discovery sends out several broadcast packets on different protocols on the subnets it's connected to figure out if there are specific assets from specific vendors operating on the network. It'll then send out ICMP scans to look for the OUIs, and then it'll send out active discovery based upon either the broadcast information it gathered or the OUI information. It'll send out active queries to those specific assets to gather information of specifically what they are, like as any active query would be. But knowing that it's only on the local broadcast network, it's done in a much safer manner than typical active querying, because it knows what every asset is before it sends an active query out to those devices. And then after that information is collected and gathered, it can either be stored in a file or sent to one of our platforms, CTD platforms on premise, or up into the Claroty cloud. If a customer wants to take a zero infrastructure approach to this, it can be sent up to our cloud so they can use it as a SaaS offering without really the need for any infrastructure on premise.
Okay, well, that was good. Now I got the demonstration, and I told you I would do this. I wanted to give my 2 to 3 minute explanation of what I thought I saw. And I would say it's not terribly different than what you said. But it really, to me, is saying I'm going to separate detection and asset inventory. That you do need the common backend. So you need either the CTD, the Claroty Threat Detection, or the cloud, and you need to configure those and configure things to communicate up to those. So there is some level of installation to get the information there. But it's saying, if I'm really interested in asset inventory, I can do this. I can do Edge. Or if I want detection and additional information on asset inventory that could be available from passive. For example, something new being connected to the network to be added to the asset inventory, or maybe a logic change. You could get some asset inventory there. But if I'm just interested in asset inventory, I can go down this path. If I want a richer monitored asset inventory and detection, then I can add in this other one. And in terms of the newness, I mean, you are talking about installing something on a system. So that's where I push back a little bit when the press release said no install. Well, no, you have to install an executable. You can do that through SCCM. You can do that through GPO. You have to install a CTD or the ability to send information to the cloud. So there is some install involved. And that file, to me, is a little bit like, that executable is a little bit like the agents that we saw back in 2000, maybe 5 or 8 from Industrial Defender. Verve is getting information into their system that way. So it's much more that approach, although I think it's lighter weight than those agents. You know, you might not call it, whether it's an agent or an executable, I think you could get some terminology argument. So I see that. And then the last element that you hit on, but I think is really important, is PAS has traditionally done this method. The way they've gathered information hasn't been passive. It's been, hey, we're going to look at these engineering files and we're going to parse them out. And that's how we're going to create a much richer asset inventory. So as I understand it, that's one of the elements of the executable, is that it will pull those files back. And you've currently got support. We'll put a screenshot up here. You currently have support for what we're seeing here on the screen for these systems. And I assume just like the protocols grow over time, that's going to grow. So in my mind, it's an asset inventory vulnerability management solution, not a detection solution. And rather than saying, I'm going to buy one product that does both, you actually can go down this different path. So I've talked for a while there, so feel free to push back on any of that or enhance any of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great clarification, Dale. I think I kind of jumped from the why to the how. And I think if I kind of back up to the what, the goal is really aligning the technology strategy to a typical customer journey. Like threat detection, incident data is too cumbersome, has a very high TCO for customers to fully staff up a SOC. And the theory of the case is if we can slim down the technology approach from an infrastructure, software, and functionality perspective to where most asset owners really need to start their program, which is around asset inventory, vulnerability management, and risk mitigation, it's the right for me starting place for a lot of organizations. And the thought process is when they're ready for their next step in the journey to secure remote access, to mitigate the risk of identity-based attacks on their assets, or move to threat detection, it can always be because we have either the same platform or integrations with our platforms. Customers can then take the next step in the journey when it's appropriate for them. Trying to ensure that the packaging and technology is aligned to how customers would typically think about their journey. So that's one point I wanted to make. And the second point I'll make, we can hem and haw about installation, about how to define the term installation. I guess the key meta point from our perspective is that there's no services running. There's no need for there's no libraries that are installed. It is simply, the same as like Minesweeper. It executes, and when it stops running, the file can, there's no application left running on the system. It can be deleted. One of our automation vendor partners utilizes the service as a part of a risk assessment offering, so that once it's run, and is run typically through SCCM, after it runs, the agent is actually deleted or dissolved, so that there's no asset or no application left running in the environment. The last point I'll just make is in terms of like the natural inclination from a lot of people might be, well, like you're putting something on our HMIs or engineering workstations. How do we ensure that it's not going to, we might have antiquated or lower horsepower systems? How do we ensure it to interfere with the normal processing of that application? Well, Edge itself, again, it is not run continuously like passive collection is. It's run either based upon a command to do it on the system itself, or it can be run through SCCM or GPO to run at a certain date and time. So you kind of get a snapshot of the environment at that place in time. And when it runs, typically it's less than 100 megs of RAM that it runs on is what we typically see. And we have protections in place that if it's over a certain amount, it kills its own process and stops running. It typically runs on anything Windows 7 or equivalent on the server side and higher. And it's a very small executable. It's like 40 meg executable. So we've really tried to think about the constraints within OT environments to ensure that we were not cumbersome on the system or in the environment.
In a normal asset, when it's being used for asset inventory, in a normal situation, it would be, for all but the smallest systems, it would be automated, again, using SCCM or GPO or something else to maybe some people might delete it every time, but just to periodically run and report back, whether it be daily or weekly or monthly, whatever they do, almost like you would do with active scanning. That's the difference between passive and active. Passive is always sitting there watching. And then the active argument is, well, I'm going to just check every day and maybe I won't. For asset inventory, that's more than enough. I do want to talk a little bit about active, but before we get there, the other claim was on visibility. So it's at 100% visibility. And that might be a little aggressive with the truth, because it's 100% visibility. So on the Windows system that you're on, for example, you're able to see everything on that Windows system. Right. That makes sense. So 100% visibility there. Perhaps 100% visibility in terms of if you can get that engineering workstation file and you can parse that. But if you don't have that, or if there's something that isn't in that file, as I understood it from the demo, essentially it's just you're getting some visibility on anything in the subnet in the system you reside on. So those other assets, you might not get 100% visibility. And that was actually switchable, right? You could turn on and off whether you wanted that Windows device to probe the subnet for other things. And you could even, there's a little bit of customization as to what type of probing it did. It could do, very light, just almost some broadcast stuff, or it could go more deeply. But you're getting 100% visibility on the assets you have access to. You're not saying you're getting 100% visibility in the system, as I understood it. Am I missing something there?
No, that you're entirely right, Dale. A couple of points to make here. One is gathering inventory of the system. So unless you have WMI set up, WMI query set up, you're not going to get all of that inventory data from the system itself. So running it on the Windows system provides that information, which is a benefit. The project files, again, there's inordinate details in those project files. And as you saw from the list, one of the areas we have support for is the Okagawa DCS systems. And so people are really hesitant, of course, to send out active queries to a DCS. So by having Edge run on the DCS itself, it's gathering the project file information and can, again, deconstruct it or dissect it to get the visibility. On top of that, we have over 30 protocols that we have active support for today. And we, as customer, as the usual suspects that you might expect due to prevalence within OT environments, and we continue to add to that. That being said, of course, it is limited to the subnets that it's connected to. And that's one of the safety features is we don't want to send blind active queries across the network that we don't either have information from a broadcast on what the system is or from OUI data on what the system is itself. So, but you're precisely right that the 100% visibility is for the things that are supported today within the protocol, or the things that we have that the Edge, the system that Edge is running on, are connected to from a subnet perspective.
Yeah, and I mean, you have the same issue with passive as well. With your passive product, if you're not on a spam port on a switch, then you're not going to see any communication that isn't going over that switch, right? It's just not talking to it. It's not going to know about it. It's just not some, I guess, where I maybe push back a little bit is it's not some magical wizard thing where you buy Edge and you don't have to do anything and you learn everything. It's not no install. It's not 100%, but it is. I do grant you that it is reduced. You are getting a lot of information. I think the biggest thing that you're getting over active is that parsing of the engineering workstation files that PAS and MDT and others have done for years. One thing I liked, and I verified this in the demo, is that you're actually getting the object blocks like in Siemens, and you'll actually be able to tell, hey, there's been a change. Someone has changed this element in the control system, and you could track that against your change control to see, was that an authorized process change or not? So a lot of really cool things there. Feel free to comment on that, but I also wanted to just dig a little bit into this active versus executable. Well, we're back. We had a little power blip there and some things needed to be rebooted, but Grant, I want to pick up maybe with the question of, you've got this way that you're doing it in OT Edge, but why is this method of putting an executable on the Windows systems to gather that information and probe out from there a better way of doing it than the active approach that, quite frankly, is in Claroty and your competitors, and in OT base, where you actually use WMI or something like that to gather the information, use the Rockwell protocol to gather the Rockwell information? Why not go that approach combined with like the PAS approach of just pulling down these engineering files and doing it on a central system? Why is deploying this executable across multiple windows a better solution in your opinion?
Yeah, the bottom line is that we think options are a good thing. So we have passive collection, we have active querying, and now Claroty Edge. With active querying, there's always a risk that exists that if you're querying past the subnet, you may not know what the assets are. And as we know, some OT assets can be as fragile as glass. And so therefore, with the Claroty Edge approach, in addition to not having to send queries across the environment, on top of that, there's no infrastructure per se required. Just using the executable, There's no infrastructure that needs to be installed. There's no querying that needs to be set up because it discovers what's on the infrastructure around it. And it is probably an easier lift for organizations that are just starting out their program. And then they can determine to go into a more full active querying mode once they understand their environment, or then augment it with passive. So it really is providing optionality for our customers.
Okay, I want to finish up maybe with one more technical question, then we'll talk a little more broadly about the company. If we look at OT Edge as really focused on asset inventory and vulnerability management, as you described, I think that's a fair way of putting it. That's part of asset management. There's also change management, configuration management, actually applying the patches, not just knowing what they are, but actually applying the patches and such. Do you see Claroty getting into that area to have a full asset management product, or are you looking to integrate with those other solutions?
Yeah, the bottom line, we think, is that we play an important role as a system of record for organizations, or for many organizations, the source of truth. At the same time, our goal really at this stage in our development is to be part of that ecosystem of solutions. And so we have an open API ecosystem. We have out-of-the-box integrations with ServiceNow and BMC Remedy. So our strategy is really to kind of focus on the areas that we want to take on and be best in class at, and really to integrate with those other solutions at this stage in our growth.
Which seems to be, so far, I haven't seen anyone looking to take it all on, although there's a few that are doing change management as well. But it really is, I think it's almost like this product is entering a new market in the sense of it's got to compete against asset management solutions now. As opposed to saying, hey, we can do asset management and detection. If you look at Claroty Edge, it is just doing asset management, although again, the back end is the same, so you could make the argument the other way. Why don't we go a little broader?
Sure.
One of the things I asked Rob Lee this question when I had him on after their big raise. I'm kind of curious to ask you the same question. You got this big pile of money now, $140 million. Just looking at my numbers here, Claroty has raised to date $235 million, which I think is the largest in the OT security space in terms of total amount raised, as well as the largest round. Bessemer, 40 North, some of your leads there in this latest round. What are you looking to do with the money? What did you tell those people you're going to do? Why did they invest $140 million in you? What do they think you're going to do with those funds?
Yeah, and if I could actually, before I address that,
Sure.
I think more importantly, this is a testament into the size and scope of the problem, and I think the conviction of a number of the leading investors in the world that they view this as an existential risk to governments, to supply chains, critical infrastructure that needs to be addressed. And why any investors focus on an investment this large is because of three things: market opportunity, which I touched on, the team, and the strategy. And so I'll jump to strategy, and if you want to talk more about market or team, we can talk about that a little bit later. And so in terms of the strategy, there's really kind of a threefold focus for our raise. The first is in terms of expanding our go-to-market efforts. In our transition from a startup into a growth stage startup over the past couple of years, we've really tried, if I could encapsulate it in one word, it was focus. Rather than trying to attempt to figure out product market fit, it was really, let's be really crisp on the verticals we're going after as our primary verticals, really crisp on the tier one countries that we're going after and the size of organizations that we're going after, our direct and partner strategy. And with this war chest, the first of those reasons is really to expand our vertical focus, really to expand our country focus to ensure that we can scale the go-to-market engine to the next level. Second really comes down to product, right, and technology platform. As you saw, our thesis really relies upon the fact that it's not just about brownfield OT assets, but as new greenfield assets enter the four walls of the plant, they can introduce risk to the process. And so really, we're taking kind of an asset-centric view as opposed to an OT-centric view, so that anything that can introduce risk to the process is in scope of what we're focusing on. And the second piece of it is we also believe that is a lot of CISOs and asset owners are not really sure how to approach this area of OT security. They're not looking necessarily for point products, but they're really looking for a best-in-class set of solutions from one vendor. And so, as we have Claroty CTD historically, we expanded into secure remote access and had a number of our competitors follow us there. Now we're expanding into Claroty Edge as another collection method. We believe that there's opportunities to increase our offering base, and also with our shift, with the introduction of CTD Live, also ensuring that for more forward-leaning organizations, they can leverage our cloud offering as opposed to having infrastructure on-prem. The third focus area is really inorganic. Our focus really is executing our strategy, but insofar as there are opportunities in the market to accelerate the execution of our strategy through inorganic growth, we're going to take advantage of those as well. And those are kind of the three focus areas for us.
A lot to chew on there. I guess I just want to make a comment on the market size. It's kind of interesting. I had, and people might have already watched it by the time this comes out, but I had Pat Kennedy, who's the founder of OSI Soft, on the show. And OSI Soft recently sold to Aviva for $5 billion. And it really says something about the market space. I know you're not going to give me any valuation numbers, post-money valuation numbers, but I've estimated there's somewhere around $1 billion, give or take, $250,000 for Dragos and Claroty. And when you compare, OSI Soft is in just about every big company that Claroty would want to sell into, or any of your competitors would want to sell into, and just is so dominant in that space, in that historian data broker space. It's amazing that the valuation of 1 billion versus 5 billion, you would expect it to be more like 20 to 1 or 100 to 1, but the market believes the growth in this space is large. And the market will do what the market will do, right? We'll find out if they're right or wrong, if it's bigger or smaller. But right now, that's the bet that's being placed by some people, and they're putting their money out there. They're not just writing articles like I do. So I'm impressed by that. One thing you said at the end, or on the product side, I wanted to touch on that is unusual, is do you think, you talked about having this full product line. Do you think that there will be OT security vendors that essentially will try to meet the needs across the security realm? So you mentioned secure remote access. Well, by that nature, you would say, well, why don't you do endpoint protection for OT? Why don't you do firewalls for OT? Do you see that there will be go-to OT security companies? Because we haven't seen that in IT, and we haven't seen that yet in OT. That would be unusual.
Yeah, our aperture at this point is really focused on areas that we think are really closely adjacent to what we do, and that is, the natural adjacencies between the asset vulnerability, risk, threat piece, and then on secure remote access, multi-factor authentication, SAML, ensuring that users are who they claim to be. So we're really focused on adjacencies as opposed to branching out into areas that our technology alliance partners are engaged in. So we have a number of pretty strong technology alliance partners there, and I think one needs to be really careful about branching out into areas that that could turn your allies into potential competitors. So we don't think that's in the cards in any time in the near future.
Yeah, and the secure remote access, I think, is probably not adjacent, but it was something people were asking for. I noticed a lot of your competitors did that as well in the COVID times to crank out a product just because they were being asked and they were trusted. What about, I wrote about the team a little bit. Now, you've been there for a little over a year. So as your CEO and a few others, there was a pretty big team shift. Did a strategy shift go along with that, or what was the reason why the team shifted so much about a year ago?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot that has changed and there's a lot that has stayed the same. I would say fundamentally the strategy that the company is executing is the same strategy. It's some refinements that we've made in terms of how we think about the market, in terms of the assets we're focusing on protecting, the offerings that we're trying to bring forth to execute on the strategy. But I'll say, broadly speaking, the strategy is the same. I would describe really what has what is different is in terms of the company's shift from a organization that was trying to figure out product market fit to 2, 3, 4 years ago, to one that has clearly figured out product market fit and now was shifted into the growth stage. And so the talent that we needed to augment the existing executive team with needed to change a little bit. And so we brought on board Yaniv Vardi, who has spent time as in asset intensive industries, being a provider to asset intensive industries, a new chief financial officer, a CRO that was head of NTT security. I joined, and a new general counsel. So it really was kind of augmenting the team for the next stage of growth. Now, what has stayed the same is that all three founders of the company are still with the organization. Benny Parat is CTO, is my kind of partner in crime on the technology side. Galina Antovic is still our chief business development officer. And Amir Zilberstein is chairman of the board now. So all three are still actively engaged, and it's really about taking the company to its next stage of growth.
Yeah, I guess I didn't expect to dig up too much dirt there, but I do think, and I wrote this, that to me, at least, as someone looking at the market, the investment this round meant that at least the investors had confidence in the new management team. So that's saying something. You mentioned early on partners. I just wanted to touch on two other quick things here. Partners, having worked with a number of asset owners as they're acquiring these types of products, the partnerships, and again, I haven't seen much because I haven't been out of my house in about a year or so here. But back in 2019, the partnerships were really not very effective across the industry. I'm not making a comment about Claroty, but when we would look at, they would sometimes the vendors would push us to partners. We'd talk to the partners and we'd just say, look, they know less about the product than we do. So why would we trust them to install it? When maybe it's already now, but when do you think the partners are actually going to be ready to take the lead, to actually go in and say, here's the product, here's how it's used, here's how it's installed, here's the services we're going to provide around it? Do you feel like they're there now, or if not, when do you think they'll be there?
Yeah, I guess I would take, in my aperture I've been in cybersecurity for 25 years. My aperture in OT security is 15 months, so I may be missing some historical perspective here. But I would say that again, mileage is going to vary a bit in terms of each individual automation vendor's company strategies. But we see that in terms of the partner, in terms of whether it's a direct-led deal or a partner-led deal, many of our automation vendor partners are taking lead in the deal. They have services that are wrapping around the offerings. Obviously, there's always a certain degree of specialized knowledge of the products that if you're not the developer of the product, you may be missing on. But we think they're actually very effective in terms of as a go-to-market lens and also providing services around our offerings.
Okay. And then the last area I wanted to talk to you about, maybe just kind of a out of the blue question here, is, are you seeing Azure and maybe Cisco, are they competitors? Because Azure bought CyberX, they're doing detection, asset inventory, software as a service sort of thing. And Cisco also made an acquisition and is starting to do those things. Do you see those vendors as competitors?
Yeah, certainly as competitors for budget dollars. We do see them as competitors. I think it's more our goal is co-opetition. Like with any large company, you're going to compete on certain fronts and cooperate on other fronts. If you look at Cisco's strategy or Microsoft's strategy, the OT security play is not really the brass ring they're going for. It's really for Microsoft selling infrastructure, selling Azure, and helping ensure customers are in the Azure cloud. And for Cisco, it's selling infrastructure. It's making sure that that they can provide value-added services on top of the software. But I would say that we can, if I were to look at all of our, looked at all 2020 qualified pipeline, I won't give you specific numbers, but Cisco is in a de minimis number of our deals. Microsoft is in a de minimis number of our deals. It really is some of the more pure play leading vendors that we see in the deals more prevalently in the marketplace.
Yeah, that aligns with what I'm seeing. Yeah. And I forgot to ask, I was going to ask you, I was going to ask you about pricing, but you already told me you're not going to tell me about pricing. So, so I guess we won't get that answer in terms of Claroty Edge. But
yeah, if you want, I can make a comment on that.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. So, look, the thought process that we have is that pricing needs to be focused on for customers, simplicity, measurability, predictability, and value alignment. Those are kind of the underlying core principles that we think about. Simplicity is really kind of core to this. And so if you go to an asset owner and say, well, we want to price based upon the number of assets, they're like, well, I don't know the number of assets. That's why I'm engaging in this project in the first place. And so our pricing model is based upon the number of sites an organization has. And within each site, we have tiers of numbers of assets. And so if organizations don't know, we ask them to come up with the best assessment of their organization, and we can kind of true up at renewal time. But we're trying to make the offering more focused around value and less around selling infrastructure. Now, specifically as it relates to Claroty, our orientation is that there will be that whatever the organization's initial collection method is, there's one price for that, whether it's edge or passive or active. And insofar as they want to then extend that same site into another collection method, then there's a discount off of the second collection method for that site. And so one might say, well, how, why would we have edge and passive at the same price? Because passive also includes threat detection. And if I can kind of preempt your next question there, the thinking is that the total cost of ownership is so much with Claroty Edge because an organization doesn't need to have infrastructure in place. They don't need to make configuration changes. The TCO is so much lower that it provides a economic benefit to having Edge put in place as a starting point for organizations.
That is a surprise. I thought Edge would be dramatically cheaper because there weren't sensors.
Yeah, but, and so again, the goal is not to charge based upon infrastructure per se, but charge based upon value and total cost of ownership for organizations.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. I'm glad you clarified that was more than I was expecting. I will just make one comment. You are right, especially on the detection side. The product cost is a minor part of actually doing detection.
Yeah.
Of course, we saw this in the IT world as well. There were a bunch of IDS deployed that were never looked at. So if you never look at it, never use it, then the product cost is the main cost. But if you're actually going to use what you purchased for the reason you purchased it, then the product cost tends to be a smaller part of it. Well, I appreciate you coming on the show, Grant. Again, congratulations on the raise, and we'll be watching and writing about it as I always do.
Dale, thanks for having me on the show.